Okay, good afternoon. And this is our last panel for today. And I'm very glad to invite to the stage. I'm very thankful to have here Michael Weiss and Nicolas Tenzer. And we'll start with Michael. This is the last panel, which is Truth in Turbulence, Navigating Factual Media and Disinformation. What we're going to have is their bios on the screen, and this is just a short version of their bios because they are both very, very accomplished fighters against the bad guys in their own way. Michael is an investigative journalist who has broken out lately some pretty interesting and quite profound investigations together with Hristo Grozev, and he's going to share some of his insights based on these investigations. And he's also the author of a best-selling book, Inside the Army of Terror, and the new book, which he's writing on the GRU, which I'm really eager and looking forward, and it will be coming next year, Michael, 2025, Glass House. So welcome to the stage, Michael Weiss, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rala, for that introduction. I have been studying Russian disinformation and propaganda for about 10 years. It started after the first Russian invasion of Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea. I co-wrote a paper with Peter Pomerantsev called The Menace of Unreality, which in hindsight, I think was rather quaint and coy in its findings. We focused mainly on what the Russians were doing in Ukraine with respect to fake news, fabricated allegations of Ukrainian atrocities against ethnic Russians, a lot of it circulated by Alexander Dugin, et cetera. And what we tried to do was understand the historical sweep, going back to the Soviet period, going back, frankly, to 1917 and the creation of the ČK and the GRU, when sort of active measures, even though they weren't necessarily known as active measures back then, were introduced as essentially a tool of revolutionary warfare, preparing for the inevitable proletarian dictatorship that would spread throughout industrialized Europe and then hopefully to them the globe, and also for preparing for war, an imminent showdown with the West and Western empires, which they thought the next world war would lead to this grand sort of series of revolutions. Well, things are a little bit different now, but also the same. There are two main tropes that I want to talk about today. We have seen them applied from 2014, but also really 2016 with respect to election interference. And obviously, the Kremlin has interfered in almost every major liberal democratic election since. But because I'm an American, I'm going to do the obnoxious thing in Europe and speak from an American-centric point of view, because I know my country better than most. 2016, I assume people are at least familiar with the essential findings of the Mueller investigation. The Republican-controlled Senate Subcommittee on Intelligence also put out a 5-volume series of reports looking into exactly what it was that the Russians were doing. Obviously, the GRU cyber units hacking emails belonging to the Democratic National Committee, Hillary Clinton's chief of staff, leaking those emails to WikiLeaks and creating fake personae that would also launder and distribute these emails in order to create divisiveness, to sow confusion, to frankly give people such as myself, journalists, something to talk and write about, which was things other than, for instance, the rise of Donald Trump and the threat that he posed to the very existence of American democracy. And it worked because sorry to say, American law enforcement, counterintelligence services were very slow on the uptake. They did not realize the extent of this threat, and once they did, it was already too late because the stuff had spread like wildfire. But there were two main elements to what the Russians were doing back then. They were impersonation and amplification. So amplification, taking actual communications belonging to a party that they did not want to see win the White House, distributing that information, and allowing party political interests, obviously a lot of Republicans and conservatives, certainly Donald Trump and his MAGA movement and their consortium of bloggers and influencers seized upon things, sometimes actually quite often taking them out of context, distorting them, but really pushing this notion that the Democratic Party was fundamentally corrupt. The primary had been stolen from Bernie Sanders, this insurgent populist candidate who was on the far left of the spectrum, at least by American standards. And that, I mean, for instance, Hillary Clinton was talking about the creation of ISIS as a Saudi proxy in one set of emails, even though she had been forwarding emails that were sent to her without any kind of critical or analytic lens applied to them. But, you know, this kind of thing. This was amplification in the sense that all that the Russians had to do was allow this stuff into the information ecosystem and then let the Americans who would be most interested in it run with it. And then, of course, using their state media and state propaganda apparatus, namely RT and Sputnik, simply lean in and push this stuff very, very hard. And it had this sort of, you know, infinite regression cycle where Americans who started to come up with their own rather elaborate conspiracy theories, what was known as Pizzagate, which, to those of you who might be unfamiliar, I'm not making this up, Hillary Clinton and the Democrats ran a satanic pedophile ring in the basement of a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. Now, this did not come from Russia. This came from within. This was a homegrown sort of act of febrile lunacy. However, the Russians, being the Russians, were all too happy to push this out and to act as if that this indeed was a legitimate allegation. The one instance where the Russians did concoct their own information scheme, as evidenced in an investigation by my former colleague at Yahoo News, Michael Isikoff, the SVR, it had been established, did come up with this conspiracy theory that Seth Rich, who was a former Democratic Party official, murdered in his street corner in Washington, D.C., that murdered after a mugging, it seems, that actually he had been taken out by the Democratic Party, and that perhaps even Seth Rich was the origin of the hacked or the distributed emails from the DNC and John Podesta, Hillary Clinton's chief of staff. So that's one bit where there was an actual invention by the Russians, which was then inserted into this information space and also went viral and was taken up by all of Clinton's enemies. Impersonation. Yevgeny Prigozhin and what was then known as the Internet Research Agency or the St. Petersburg Troll Farm, hirelings who were paid to work round the clock pretending to be Americans, posting things on Facebook, in some cases buying ads on Facebook, where they kind of spread themselves rather promiscuously. One day they were for Black Lives Matter. The other day they were trafficking in rather racist stereotypes about black people and racist tropes, catering to both MAGA and the far left. They were both pro-immigrant and xenophobic at the same time. So they wanted to create this divisiveness. They wanted to undermine any sense of social cohesion or consensus. The impact that they had is litigated to this day, right? You can do quantitative analysis, how many bots are created, how many fake ads are bought, how many posts are, but to do a qualitative analysis is rather hard, right? If you're inclined to already suspect or dislike Hillary Clinton as the nominee for president and perhaps not want to vote for her, it's hard to say that some St. Petersburg created fake ad is what tipped you into voting for Donald Trump, right? But the very act of trying to adjudicate this or to determine the impact that Russian active measures in the 2016 election had was itself an active measure, right? I mean, the Russians are probably hugging themselves with glee because the United States sort of tore itself apart, and not just in the immediate aftermath of the election, but for several years. I mean, we still to this day see people who think that the Mueller investigation was a hoax, right? That the Russians did nothing, that the GRU did not hack anybody, that this whole thing was a actual concocted conspiracy theory from the left and from the so-called deep state, which is the constellation of the FBI, the State Department, the CIA, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, the very act of not knowing to what extent the Russians might have swayed a U.S. presidential election allowed us to sort of cannibalize ourselves even further at the intellectual and moral level, which I think is also a net gain and one of the added benefits of these sort of disinformation schemes. What we're seeing now, and when I started to prepare this presentation, I confess I was worried I was going to be a little more tedious than I hoped to be, because up until very recently, all of the evidence suggested the Russians were not being as successful, or rather they were plying the same trade, but to diminishing returns. So in other words, yeah, sure, they continue to buy fake ads on Facebook, or now what's called Meta. They push bots on Twitter. But social media companies, at least until very recently, with respect to Twitter that is, did a fairly good job of policing this stuff, right? They sort of got religion after 2016 and realized that they had to take down these artificially created entities. Meta in particular puts out quarterly reports analyzing Russian interference schemes, not just Russian interference schemes, Iranian, Chinese, everybody's getting into this business now. And these reports are rather anticlimactic reading, because what they say is, we noticed X, Y, and Z, but the exposure that these things had was much, much lower than the state actors would have liked. Well, why do I say that all of this sounds tedious until very recently? Within the last 3 weeks, both the US State Department and the Department of Defense have come out with a series of disclosures in the form, in many cases, of indictments, showing that the Russians have upped their game. So at the level of amplification, what they have now decided to do, and frankly, I'm surprised that they didn't do this in 2016, or perhaps they did and we just don't know about it yet, is create fake entities which will then finance some of the influencers and party political operatives in a stealthy or clandestine manner. So the DOJ put out this big indictment against RT, or formerly Russia Today employees, who they found were spending close to $10 million, all funneled through shell companies in Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, Mauritius, whatever. $10 million to prop up a company registered in the state of Tennessee. We know that it's called Tenet Media because the indictment, even though they name Americans in it, it's very easy to figure out who these guys are. And Tenet Media was founded by two people, both on the far right, both who have trafficked in the past in conspiracy theories, pro-Bashar al-Assad conspiracy theories about Syria, conspiracy theories about ISIS, COVID, you name it. And they were encouraged by an entity that called himself Edward Gregorian, Gregorian spelled with two N's, to create this entity and to hire a bunch of commentators to make YouTube videos, podcasts, put stuff out mainly on social media that would tear down the Democratic Party, then Joe Biden as the presumptive candidate for the nomination, and also essentially push Russian Federation interests, which these people were doing anyway. But $10 million is quite a lot of money. They were spending hundreds of thousands of dollars per video in some cases, which got ample exposure on social media, I mean tens of millions of views, but would never in a million years generate the kind of revenue through advertising that these guys were being spent. So in other words, they were paying wildly above market rates for things that MAGA influencers were doing already. And these MAGA influencers act to this day as if they had no idea who was bankrolling them, right? There was some muttering about, Russians being behind it. They seemed to be okay with that. But they took this money rather gleefully into American bank accounts. And they did. They pushed, the same sort of stuff they were doing, but there was also some editorial guidance or manipulation. So for instance, they were told by the RT cutouts, we would love it if you could say that the Crocus Mall attack, which was perpetrated by ISIS-K in Moscow several months ago, was in fact a Ukrainian operation. This was a line that the Kremlin had run with, claiming that some of these jihadis had made a break for the Ukrainian border. Nobody really in the United States believed it, and those who didn't seem to break through into any kind of mainstream discourse. These guys were told, please do that, and they complied. They were also told, could you amplify, could you highlight Tucker Carlson's great tour of Russia, particularly the segment he did on his Twitter TV show, where he went to what was in fact a French grocery store, supermarket, and said, how wonderful, I mean, straight out of, Soviet sort of Potemkin theater. They wanted them to emphasize this. This was the one instance where these influencers felt that this might be shilling, quote unquote, a little too much. So it was very clear, unless they were complete idiots, that they were pushing a line that was being peddled by at least pro-Russian, if not Russian interests. This indictment actually made a big splash in the United States because the influencers looked like paid agents of the Russian Federation, although they claim they're the real victims because they were deceived using these cutouts. Edward Gregorian was a fake personae with his own CV. And the tradecraft in all this stuff was quite poor, actually. For instance, Gregorian, who again was RT employees, didn't know the time difference between Paris and Moscow. So set a Zoom call for Paris time, but actually ended up on the call Moscow time at 4 p.m. and then was literally Googling what is the time in France. So you notice that there's a rather crudeness to this. It's not all that sophisticated and artful once you dig into it, and somebody with a little bit of skepticism and critical thinking could see through it, that you're being manipulated, possibly by a hostile state actor. But the influencers didn't care because they were being lavished with so much money. The other indictment, which was of interest, was for Russian cyber operators who were pushing a campaign known as 𝖲𝖾ganger. This is a campaign of sheer impersonation. So Russian state interests, particularly those in the presidential administration, Sergei Kiriyenko, who was, I think, the first deputy first deputy chief of staff to Putin, was in charge of this program and would brief Putin personally on its progress. They would create fake news portals that looked very much like the Washington Post, Fox News, CNN, even with the logos done in the same aesthetic manner, but with URLs that were slightly different. So that even if you if you had a typo in your URL, you would wind up in these. And it was exactly the kind of thing that you thought. The war in Ukraine is going terribly. The West is to blame. There was an emphasis on quote, nuclear psychosis. So Western security assistance to Ukraine is going to lead to World War III. This is the line that we need to convince the Americans of. And all of this you see kind of imbibed and assimilated into the worldviews of a lot of people who might not necessarily be controlled or paid by the Russian Federation, but are incorporating this into their, shall we say, skepticism about support for Ukraine. But they also targeted other countries in Europe. Germany was a huge target. Spiegel, German news outlets were being faked through 𝖲Լganger. And the emphasis they would always make was you have to remember that you are a fake German pretending to speak to other Germans. So authenticity was key. Also, it was all about mixing disinformation with actual fact. The maximum amount of disinformation, the maximum amount of factuality. I mean, very rarely will the Russians come up with something so wildishly outlandish. Usually what they're doing is they're inserting bits of truth, bits of verifiable fact into a grander kind of conspiracy because it has to seem plausible. 𝖲Լganger resulted in the takedown of something like 40 fake URLs by the FBI. It led to the indictments of the aforementioned Russians, particularly in the presidential administration. But it also showed that the impact that they were having was greater than what social media companies had been saying for several years, right? These websites were reaching large numbers of audiences and extended far beyond the confines of the United States. Also of interest in this disclosure was that the same actors behind 𝖲Լganger had identified 2,800 influencers across 49 countries who they knew were already peddling a pro-Moscow position. Now, if they've identified those influencers, what are they going to do? Are they going to simply amplify the narratives that they're putting out? Are they going to perhaps come up with schemes to create fake entities to pay those influencers? So, I mean, we're sort of scratching the surface of this next level or this escalation in what the Russians are doing with respect to impersonation and amplification. Now, here's where it gets a little bit complicated and politicized. The rollout of these indictments, particularly the first one that I alluded to, featuring Tenet Media, Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, gave this big press conference, and this was all couched as election interference. I mean, obviously, we're on the eve of a rather decisive and possibly seismic US presidential election, and the Russians have formed with this, and this is not terribly shocking to an American audience that they'd be doing this. But in fact, the real scheme, the real purpose of these campaigns was to degrade American support for Ukraine. And US officials, US intelligence officers have told me on deep background that this was all about Ukraine. And there's a great deal of concern at very high levels in the US government that if they discuss just how far the Russians are willing to go to weaken support, that it might actually have unintentionally that effect of weakening support. You know, this has to be taken in concert with what else is taking place now. It's happening in Europe. It will eventually happen in the United States if it hasn't already. And that is remote-controlled sabotage operations run by the GRU. So I'm speaking in Bulgaria. In 2011, GRU Unit 29155, this is the Black Ops or Special Tasks Unit of Russian military intelligence, blew up an ammunition depot in 𝖤𝖾 in Bulgaria. And the ammunition that was stored in this facility was owned by EMCO, whose CEO, Emilian Gebrev, was subsequently poisoned with a Novichok-like substance by Unit 29155 members right here in Sofia in 2015. The ammunition stored in this depot was destined for 3 places. One was the country of Georgia, which was looking to rearm after its 2008 war with Russia. One were Syrian rebels opposed to Bashar al-Assad's regime. So this was 2011. The Russians intervened directly 4 years later in 2015. Can you guess the third country the ammunition was destined for? Ukraine. This is 2011, 3 years before the first invasion, the takeover of Crimea, and the instigation of a plausibly deniable dirty war in Donbass using conventional Russian forces, GRU officers, FSB officers. Okay, so they've been doing this. Oh, and I should also mention 2011 is right in the midst of the Obama-Russian so-called reset, when we were going to restore relations to a kind of stable and reliable transactional posture with Moscow. So Russia has been doing terrorist operations in NATO, EU countries since 2011. They repeated their act several times, at least half a dozen times in Bulgaria, once in Czechia, in a town that was also hosting or a Czech Ministry of Defense controlled facility that was stockpiling weapons and ammunition similarly destined for Ukraine and also Georgia. However, now, thanks to my colleague Christo Grozev, 29155 has been unmasked and rolled up. They cannot travel to Europe. Their biometrics are in every database on the continent. So what are they doing? Well, they are reaching riffraff and amateurs and common criminals, usually young men, all over the continent, connecting with them on Telegram, using cutouts, intermediaries, recruiter agents, paying them, offering them money, cryptocurrency, in some cases 400 euro, in other cases maybe 2,000, to throw petrol bombs at places that, for instance, commemorate communism in Riga, museums of occupation. In one case, they got a Latvian group to daub graffiti onto the wall of Estonia's NATO Center of Cybersecurity Excellence, saying that Killnet had hacked that center. They're doing provocations, but they're also doing kinetic activities. We have evidence that I did a joint investigation with Estonian and Latvian partners based on Estonian and Latvian court documents that some of these Latvians that had been recruited even traveled to Ukraine in January of 2022 to firebomb a military facility, the location and name of which was undisclosed in the court documents for security purposes. So even before the full-scale invasion, the GRU is recruiting Europeans to conduct sabotage, diversionary, or shall we say, terrorist operations in the heart of Europe. And this is another big problem that is now being dealt with. It's one of the reasons, by the way, it's being cited by the administration and its validators in the press as to why the Biden administration might be reluctant to authorize Ukraine to do deep strikes into Russian territory using American and European-made missiles. Horizontal escalation. You know, they might arm the Houthis, but they might also escalate in terms of what the GRU is doing in recruiting Westerners. Now, I mean, you saw my CV here. I wrote a book on ISIS. When I start telling people what the GRU is up to, and they say, well, this kind of sounds familiar, because in 2015, wasn't this what the caliphate was doing when the caliphate was crumbling? They could no longer bring their operatives from Europe, train them up in Syria and Iraq, and dispatch them back to places like Paris where they could perpetrate the Bataclan massacre. So instead, they were remote recruiting jihadis who pledged allegiance to ISIS, and then without the incentive of money, because they were ideologues, would go and start blowing things up. Yeah, that's exactly right. That's what counterintelligence will say. Now, here's the danger. You rely on amateurs as opposed to trained Spetsnaz officers who construct detonation devices and know how to plant bombs. As criminal and grisly as that may be, what's going to happen? Well, with amateurs, the potential for collateral damage skyrockets. So you're going to start seeing things blow up, and you're going to start seeing innocent people get killed. And then what is the West's response going to be? And then, to bring this back to the original discussion of disinformation and propaganda, how are the Russians going to instrumentalize this? Well, they could blame ISIS, they could blame Ukraine, they could say it was a false flag designed to gin up Russophobia. So this is, I'm trying to anticipate the sort of third wave, if you like, of Russian information operations. It's going to be done in conjunction with kinetic activity. I mean, it already has, obviously, the invasion of Ukraine, both Mark I and Mark II. But now it's coming to a theater near you, and it's been here already. Except first they were targeting weapons and ammunition destined for Ukraine. Now they're just targeting military facilities, places that are engaged in security assistance, but also malls, bus depots, soft civilian targets. These are actual operations that have been exposed by European counterintelligence and law enforcement services attributed to the Russian intelligence services. So I know that sounds really scary. It's sort of meant to. And I keep coming back to this question, and forgive me if I'm running over time. What is the Western antibodies for this? What is our real resilience to it? And unfortunately, I don't have good answers there either, because one of the investigations Christo and I are working on is, why aren't we hearing about all of these operations? Some of them we are hearing about. The Poles have come clean, the Latvians, the Estonians. And the answer is, there's a great deal of fear that the terror and paranoia that will set in psychologically, knowing that there is now a state actor with seemingly limitless resources doing that which non-state actors have done for 25 years, means that we should simply call it quits and sue for peace and give up on Ukraine. So I'm also worried about the cover-up that will take place as to the full extent of what's going on. But I will say it is a good step in the right direction that the US government is now taking sort of preemptive action. And also, daylight is the best disinfectant, showing the full scope and the amounts of resources that are being poured into essentially recruiting assets in the United States to do the bidding of what used to be RT and Sputnik stock and trade until they got sanctioned. So she'll leave it there. Yep.
Thank you very much, Michael. I would like to invite now Nicolas. Nicolas is a public servant and a public intellectual, very prolific writer and frequent speaker on French media. And if you don't follow Michael and Nicolas on Twitter, follow them because they are a source of very valuable information. So, Nicolas, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ralitza, and thank you also, Michael, to have made, basically transitions to my main purpose today. My main purpose today is, of course, to describe, one other dimensions of Russia's war of information, which is not mostly about, I would say, disinformation, but basically misinformation of lack of information. And by information, I will of course elaborate on that. I make also lack of information about history, lack of information about narratives, lack of information about ideology, and more specifically Putin's ideology, etc. So basically, I will talk about what I called or labeled in a piece 3.5 years ago, soft propaganda. Soft propaganda is basically the way Putin's actors are trying to influence basically the democratic leaders not to take action or to take no decisive action, which is basically the point. It's not about talking about, well, we have Nazis in Kiev, or I mean, we have, of course, Ukrainians, just taking the blood of the Russian soldiers to drink it, or something. I mean, all these kind of foolish narratives, but something which is in a way more invasive, into the minds not of the general public, or not only, in the mind of general public, but the mind of the leaders. Because I have to say that the two key points of my brief comments will be, first of all, disinformation is about trying not the leader to take actions or to create a mood in the public opinion that will prevent those leaders to take decisive action, because they will have the resentment, right or wrong, that they are not allowed by the public. That's the first point. And the second point is that basically the main, I will say, target of this kind of disinformation is basically the leaders themselves. I will give you some examples. First of all, I will try to explain why, this kind of Russian propaganda was basically I will say, successful in a way. It was successful for many reasons that has nothing to do with Russia in a way. First thing is basically soft propaganda is based on ignorance. Ignorance. It could be based on foolishness or stupidity. It could be based on lack of moral sense, lack of thinking. Just to quote Hannah Arendt, the evil basically was born in the lack of willingness to think by oneself. And I think that's the point. And the other dimension is that quite often the disinformation, this kind of misinformation, or I will say soft propaganda, is based also of what I will call cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance means basically that one leader is saying one thing and basically is doing actually exactly the contrary of what he or she is saying. And I think that's quite often. I will give you some example. I will give you, first of all, just to elaborate a little bit on, the example of ignorance, and first of all, historical ignorance. If you read most of the textbooks, but also if you hear the speeches of the Western leaders, they will talk about, for instance, about, the period of 1991, 1992 in certain countries, about basically Ukraine or the Baltic states or Georgia gaining their independence, as if they never have been independent before. And when I was basically asking a lot of MPs or MEPs, in France or Germany, telling them that basically Ukraine has been independent before, Georgia or Latvia or Lithuania or Estonia, etc. Oh, they say, no, it's not possible. It's just because they want to basically get rid of the former Soviet Union. I said, no. Basically, the Soviet Union has colonized them. They were independent before. And I give some examples of other countries, could be African countries, could be Asian countries, talking about colonization. And I was explaining them that there was a kind of colonial history of the Russian regime, notably not only the only one, that we have to take into account, just to understand the mindset of those countries. And if you see that if you have in mind these kind of countries, you consider that the Soviet Union, then Russia, was a kind of legitimate power or had a legitimate grip on those countries, which is, of course, completely unacceptable, but with this kind of narrative, you change completely the vision of the history. If you read the textbooks about World War II in France, in Germany, they will hardly speak about the alliance between the Soviet Union and the Nazi regime between 1939 and 1941. They will mention, of course, the Pact Molotov-Ribbentrop. Of course, they will mention that. But, for instance, they will never show the picture of basically the German, the Nazi army, basically, demonstrating, and taking part to the patriotic march in Moscow. And so if the French, German, Spanish, Italian, etc. leaders do not have, these pictures in mind, they do not understand right now how to talk about Russia and Ukraine. So it will completely change their visions of the world. Then you will have, of course, a lot of story about, let's say, for instance, Crimea. I remember it was in 2018. I was in the Senate for a hearing, and at the end of my hearing at the French Senate, you had the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee telling me, Crimea has always been Russian. And I say, no, Mr. Chairman, two things. First of all, it's untrue. Factually, historically, it's not true. Just, sorry, I say it more politely, please read a history textbook. And the second thing is that basically doesn't matter. Because, Mr. Chairman, you said before that what is important in international relations is international law, the official recognition of borders. And so it's not a question of historical legitimacy, but it's a question of legal legitimacy. Which is important is basically what the rule of law says, what the international law says, is the questions of the compliance with the rule of law. That's what matters in international relations, because if you decide to destroy the international laws, then you may have the French savoir becoming against Italian, you may have the Britain in France becoming basically English, or you may have, etc. Another example, you may have, of course, Louisiana and Acadia, US becoming French, or whatever. You may have, you can revise the borders. And the very principles that were settled after World War II was basically we must have internationally recognized borders. And that's an example also of cognitive dissonance, because in the other speeches, this chairman of the Foreign Committee said, okay, the rule of law, international law, etc., etc. But on the other hand, he was saying exactly the contrary with concrete examples. So I can give you many examples, which is very important. The second thing is, which is very interesting, I think it was one of the key points of my book, is also that there is absolutely no understanding or no attention paid by most of the democratic leaders to international law. They want just to consider that the so-called realism in international relations have to prevent us to pay attention to international law and to the most important and blatant breaches or I will say attempt to revise international law. And especially I will give you two examples. The first example is when you had, Emmanuel Macron or other Western leaders visiting Putin during World War II coup 2018, they were shaking hands with him, congratulating him for the good organization of the World Cup. And there was quite no figures in my country, nor in Germany, nor in Italy, nor in Spain, etc., basically asking for a boycott of the World War Cup. I was one of them, I must say. One was the Green leader in France, so Yannick Jadot was doing so. There was maybe some others, but a few others. And just saying, if you consider what Putin is doing, in Syria, since especially 2015, where basically Putin has killed more Syrian civilians than even ISIS did. I have all the statistics about that. If you consider what Putin is doing in Ukraine since 2014, what he did in Georgia in 2008, basically he has committed, not talking about Chechnya, of course, a lot of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and probably in Ukraine, it's completely established, crime of genocide, and of course crime of aggression. And if you shake hands with this person, basically you consider that everything that was decided in Nuremberg is no more valid. And that you may have someone basically committing those kind of crimes without statute of limitations, without being punished or blamed. Because basically, I was talking already at that time about Putin as a war criminal or criminal against humanity. But when I said that to officials, no, you cannot say that. It's not correct, not politically correct. We have to engage Putin. And I remember at that time, it was in France. There was also the Brégançon, meeting in 2019. You had exactly the same thing in Germany. I remember had a lot of debates with Jens Plötner, the diplomatic advisor to Chancellor Scholz, saying, well, basically we have to engage Putin. It was not possible to say something, and everything that goes against the common doctrine that we have to envision reset with Mr. Putin was considered a sabotage, I heard the word, of the good German or French-Russian relations. I think that's an example. And the other example is the questions of ideologies that I was mentioning, the lack of understanding of ideology. I remember it was Brégançon meeting in August 2019, where Macron decided to establish with Russia a new architecture of security and trust. The word was pronounced, basically. And Macron said something in face of Putin, saying, well, I think that you have a very good idea, which is Europe from Lisbon to Vladivostok. I heard that. Because I'm studying Russia, Ukraine since a long time. I knew that this phrase was coined by Alexander Dugin. And it was used by Vladimir Putin in an op-ed in the Süddeutsche Zeitung from Lisbon by Vladivostok in September 2010. And so I was just wondering why President Macron, basically I said that to him after that, well, basically, why do you use that? Was probably, in his notes. Why? Because that's basically a typical phrase of what we call Eurasianism, coined by a fascist, Dugin, anti-Semitic person, etc., etc. So that's an example of this kind of narrative. No, you have a lot of other narrative. I won't mention all of them. Some were also mentioned by Michael before. Basically, the question of World War II, I devoted a whole chapter about, where it come from. And the narrative of World War II is well-known Russian propaganda, stands since a very, very long time, long before, the old war against Ukraine, or even long before 2014, the beginning of the war. We had the question of the war between Russia and NATO that we have to fear. And I remember I had a meeting with Jake Sullivan, it was in a Vilnius Summit NATO Public Forum, and we had this talk with Jake Sullivan, and Jake Sullivan was using this word. And I said, well, do you use a word that was coming directly from the Kremlin? Without knowing it. I am not suspecting Jake Sullivan to be bought by the Russians. No, it's not my point. Let's be very clear on that. Other guys in the French, German TV are using these kind of narratives. And I'm still quite certain that they are paid by the Russians. But Jake Sullivan, no. The advisor to Macron, no. I am not suspecting also Jens Plötner, advisor to Scholz, to be paid by the Russians. That's not the point. The point is that they are using this kind of representation. The other point is, just an example, each war has to be ended by negotiation, which is factually wrong. And it's also quite important. But you have always these narratives. And in my view, it's very dangerous to have, this invasive narrative coming sometimes from other countries, sometimes, unfortunately, coming, let's say, from Ukraine as well, that there must be negotiation. I think what I'm saying to many leaders, ministers, presidents, etc., prime ministers sometimes, well, you have to refrain using the word negotiation. And even the word peace is something that is useless, because it creates the feeling that at the end of the day, you will accept negotiation, and that with those negotiations, you will accept not only to throw Ukraine under the bus, but you will accept to give Mr. Putin a license to kill, because in the territories occupied by Russia, we know that happens, deportation of children, summary executions, torture, etc. And so you have certainly to refrain to talk about that. And then, just not to be too long, I think you have also a lot of narrative coming from a bad use of, I will say, international relations theory. I won't be long because I have many chapters also in my book about, this kind of thing, but one of them I will just explain very, very shortly. What I'm hearing about, this kind of soft propaganda is that's basically the war in Ukraine, Russian war against Ukraine, is a classic war. That its model is World War I, because of what we see, the trenches and all these kind of things. And when I am explaining to the people that no, it's not a classical war, even if we can, of course, discuss that there is a classical war, a model of classical war that we can discuss, but not the point. That's a war of extermination. That's a war of annihilation of the people. That the very ideology of Mr. Putin is an ideology of destruction. That you have to face absolute evil. That you have to understand that it's an ideology-driven war, hence a total war. And that there is no issue that there could be a kind of negotiation with Russia in this kind of context. And that we have basically to reframe completely our narratives. But I know also that most of the leaders of the Western countries are really afraid that we are talking right now about total war, about the all-out war, about the war of extermination. Because if you have a war of extermination, if you have, and you have, a genocide perpetrated in Ukraine, then you have to take action. And personally, I was, in France since 2014, not only 2022, one of the lonely voices advocating a direct intervention of NATO countries, not only providing Ukraine with weapons, but also taking action, because it was a kind of war. And because this ideology, that was something that I am studying. I am not the only one. You have a lot of persons also studying Putin's ideology, Timothy Snyder and others, because we are perceiving the very nature of this war. And all the narratives that we are hearing, in most of the TV shows, is trying to create a pressure, let's say, on the Western leader to consider this war as a normal war, and Russia as a normal country, and Putin as a normal president, to create a trivialized, in a way, what is happening in Ukraine. And when you have a voice or voices that make a comparisons, as I did, even if you have a lot of differences, historical differences, etc., between Mr. Putin and Hitler, when you are talking about, well, what Putin is doing to the Ukrainians, and before to the Syrians, and before to the Chechens, up to a certain extent to the Georgians, and to some Africans, what Hitler was doing to the Jews. And I testify because my family was one of the victims of the Holocaust. For me, it's really not understandable that we have still this kind of narratives. To do so, and I will just have 1 minute, since I'm still a little bit too long, how can we basically contradict and debunk this kind of soft propaganda? Of course, there are long-term solutions. teaching history, learning history, revise the classical international relations concepts, and I will say way of thinking. But I think which is very important is certainly to create more appetite among also the journalists, the intelligence services, all the persons who are in charge of basically of accompanying the fight against Russian war of information, to make them better understand what is really at stake. And to understand also that you don't have only hard narratives, but you have to learn history, you have to learn ideology. So basically you have, I mean, a kind of intellectual investment to make into this field. If you refuse to make this intellectual investment, I think you are completely lost. The second thing is that you have certainly to create more awareness about, I would say, why you have a certain number of intellectuals, sometimes journalists, political leaders, talking about this kind of narratives. I won't mention names, but I could tell that you have many names in France, which I know most particularly, of course, but also Germany, sometimes the US, who are using those narratives. And they are not doing that for free. Even some former presidents, prime ministers, and ministers. And I am not talking here about far-right persons, nor people from the radical left. I am talking about mainstream leaders. And I perfectly know that if some investigation were not launched, it's because you have a kind of complacency within the ruling class about those kind of persons. Thank you. I was maybe too long, but thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much for these insightful presentations. And again, thank you very much for being with us today in Sofia. You have extremely busy schedules. I will combine two questions into one. And since both of you have presence both in social media and in factual, so-called mainstream media, in different roles, of course, my question to you is, what is the role of mainstream media in spreading this soft propaganda that you're talking about? And on the flip side, how can mainstream media, factual media, fight against disinformation, especially given the current changing business model and the shrinking budgets of mainstream media? So,
Michael?
It's a very good question, and I alluded in my presentation that after 2016, news outlets took the decision to hire disinformation reporters that would essentially do just that: debunk fake news, ferret out the provenance of it. If it's homegrown, fine. Expose the actor doing it at home, or more provocatively, if it's of a foreign origin, show that there are adversarial intelligence services looking to do this to us. The problem is when I talked about the self-cannibalization, or the America was tearing itself apart, these issues have become so radioactive now. So, fighting disinformation, the very concept is seen as hostile action by elements on both the far right and the far left, who think that this means some kind of Orwellian censorship program, ministry of truth. They don't want the government interfering in what is true and what is not, because for them that is a form of totalitarianism. And look, I understand the United States has this sacrosanct First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, in ways that, frankly, certain European countries do not. In the UK, you can get a knock on the door by the Metropolitan Police if you tweet something that is seen to be racist or bigoted. We don't have that in the United States. and people cling very desperately to the First Amendment, such that even now that it has been established that RT has embedded intelligence officers in its apparatus. So a state media company is also a clearinghouse for intelligence operations. It doesn't matter. You'll find actors at home in the US who say, well, that's no different from the BBC or Voice of America or Radio Free Europe. So it becomes increasingly difficult to make the case that we need to have a more robust, it transcends the level of government too. Civil society has a role to play, in fact, a larger role to play here. But I don't have answers as to how do you put Humpty Dumpty back together again and create a social cohesion and consensus that arguably was never there, right? I'm old enough to remember a lot of futurist utopian claptrap in the 1990s about how the internet and digital technology was going to be this great emancipatory thing. It's going to be this vast agora of information. It's going to democratize everything and make all knowledge and information accessible. And it's sort of a tale as old as time. Alexander Herzen, the great 19th century Russian liberal, once wrote a letter to the Tsar outlining what he envisaged as the worst case scenario for Russia. And one of the things in his items was Genghis Khan with a telegraph. Yes, good people can invent technologies to do good things, but immediately evil people, dictators, strongmen, warlords, co-opt the technology to do not good things. And so we find ourselves in this sort of critical period where social media, taken over by foreign-born oligarchs, arguably with serious mental health, drug addiction problems, but also ideological psychosis problems, are now using this technology to try and sway an election. And doing so not only with impunity, but with security clearance as a major defense contractor to the Pentagon and the American government. And we don't have answers to address that problem. So I'm very pessimistic about where this heads and trends. And we find ourselves in a situation in which, the last presentation I think dealt pretty extensively with this. The first president in American history tried to foment an insurrection, denied the results of an election, did not want to see a peaceful transition of power, now stands a 50% chance of regaining power, and has already telegraphed what he wants to do in the beginning, and also has telegraphed what he plans to do should he be denied that power, i.e. lose an election again. It's almost, it's evidence against interest because we're here to talk about disinformation, but I almost think that disinformation is the least of our problems now. We have political actors who are doing pretty horrendous things.
I have not a lot to add, because I think that regarding what we have to do, what the social media and mainstream media can do about, this the kind of I will say soft narratives, I think it's completely different. First of all, one of the main difficulties is that, as I said, basically is gaining more to the mind and souls of the decision makers and intellectuals and mainstream journalists. Even if newspaper, I can give you many examples, that are supporting Ukraine in France, or let's say Le Monde, or Libération, or L'Express, etc. Sometimes you have some of the narratives who are going against and saying just, complete historical blunders and some things that have nothing to say. Then if we consider that we have to convince, the advisor of President or Prime Minister A or B, that's another story. And I think that's, for me, the main point, because I see, for instance, in the debate in the US, you have a lot of, very excellent experts coming from from ambassadors, from generals, etc., basically trying to convince President Biden or Jake Sullivan or others that basically, in not supporting fully Ukraine, they are doing an historical mistake and certainly historical sin as well. But well, it's quite difficult, and sometimes I know from my president that some of the issues that we have, we can say to him directly, could work or could not work. So that's the first point. The second point is that sometimes you have, I mean, all the remarks after each of the TV shows I am part in, the remarks of the people, the community following me on Twitter, saying, okay, it's good to have people like you and many others mentioning A or B, etc., because they understand Russia, they have studied in Russia, whereas C, D, and E, basically, they are saying crap, because they do not know, they are just basically propagating exactly the Russian classical narratives, basically that's both sides, or basically Russia is too big to fail, or blah, 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 and these kind of things. Which is basically, or you cannot defeat a nuclear power, which is wrong, by the way, because you have examples, the US in Vietnam and for the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. Well, that's two examples that come in mind, but there are some others. And so you have, I mean, part of the community on Twitter or LinkedIn or Facebook or whatever, basically. But you have segmented communities, as we know. You have segmented communities. And that's one of the main difficulties that we have. And when it comes also to, for instance, let's say, just to take an example, I am elaborating on my book more, but it's difficult, which is basically that we must not to buy into the nuclear threat from Russia, which is a key point in terms of decisive action. But then you may have some experts say, well, it's not that so simple, etc. So it's really easy, if not always successful, to debunk factually wrong narratives. But when it comes to basically strategic analysis, in which you might have, I mean, different point of view, it's certainly more difficult. But let's have a conversation. At least if we have a meaningful conversation of this kind of things, that's good.
Thank you. Yes, questions, please.
Thank you. We expect President Zelensky next week to be in US and to present his victory plan to President Biden and to candidates Vice President Harris and Mr. Donald Trump. I think it is a big event in the process of information warfare we have between Russia and us, and again, Ukraine is actually taking the lead. So my question is, how do you think this victory plan and its presentation will play in information space and will influence elections in United States depending on the response President Zelensky will receive from President Biden or the candidates? And in this context, information war, as every war, is dependent on one big event that turns the situation. Because there are everyday battles, one moves forward, after that back, but the war ends when big event happens. What is the big event that you expect in this information war? We finally to win information war with Russia, not to explain continuously how sophisticated are they, how many resources they are putting, how well organized are their services with sabotage on our territory, paying to our politicians. Is it time we to mobilize ourselves and to win this information war? Because otherwise, it could go too long and negative way for us. So these are two questions. Thank you.
So one of the things I tell the Ukrainians that they have done in the space of a little less than 3 years, in addition to defeating at a strategic level the supposed greatest army in Europe, and waging not one, not two, but 3 counteroffensives and now a surprise offensive into sovereign Russia, is that they have very, very deftly dismantled, piece by piece, a lot of built up and, as we were discussing, assimilated Russian propaganda, not beginning with Vladimir Putin, but since the Cold War period, unto the post-Soviet period, unto now. So you're looking at arguably half a century of myth-making that the Ukrainians have kind of chopped down to size. Number one, that you can take on the Russians conventionally and defeat them or beat them. Number two, that you can escalate against the Russians and not precipitate World War III. I mean, I have in my phone a list of times that some member, very high senior official in the Russian government, Putin himself in some cases, suggested that the red line was X, and if we were to do X, then it would be Armageddon. And we did X, and it wasn't Armageddon. I mean, from sending HIMARS to Ukraine, building an F-16 coalition, Western main battle tanks, ATACMS, now deep strike capability abetted by Western munitions. So I propose this. You know, the other side says there is danger ahead because the Russians might do something. Okay, but we have a ton of empirical evidence of what they haven't done in spite of threatening to do exactly that, time and time and time again. We also have empirical evidence where they kind of call their own bluff. There was a story in the Washington Post a few weeks ago. The headline was, Russia keeps setting red lines, Ukraine keeps violating them. It's a very good headline. In the story, Sergei Markov, who I know very well, I used to debate him on TV programs. And I remember knowing exactly when Russia was about to invade Ukraine because he suggested on the eve of the Olympics in 2014 that Ukraine was fomenting some kind of provocation. And that usually, you know, they love to project. They accuse the West of doing that which they themselves are about to do. Markov is used as kind of a febrile mouthpiece of the regime. In the Washington Post story, he says, we have already factored in deep strike capability and the US lifting this restriction. And you know what he didn't say as a follow-up? It's going to lead to a nuclear holocaust. I mean, there are great disincentives for why the Russians would not certainly launch strategic nuclear weapons, ICBMs at any Western city, but also tactical nuclear weapons. It doesn't achieve much on the battlefield, and the pariah effect it would have, not just among its adversaries in NATO, but also among its friends and allies, India, China. It would lead arguably to nuclear proliferation in countries that none of these countries want to see it in, including Japan, you know, Asia Pacific, in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, etc. We have to think logically and soberly, but also critically. And you know, one criticism I have of the Biden administration when it comes to this policy, they've done an admirable job, and they eventually, it's the old Churchill saw, you know, the Americans are always reliable to do the right thing once they've exhausted all of their options, right? The problem is we're playing with a lot of people's lives, and we're doing this softly, softly, slowly, slowly. We don't have a policy. A policy would be the President of the United States gives a chat from the Oval Office and says, right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to defeat Russia and Ukraine. And by defeat Russia, we're going to help the Ukrainians with everything we have, save nuclear weapons, to kick the Russians out of 1991 borders. And we're going to help the Ukrainians win back Crimea. We want total strategic defeat of Russia's conventional military capability in Ukraine. Nobody in this administration says that. The line is, we don't want Ukraine to lose, and Russia must not win. This is a very interesting formulation. So crisis management is not a good policy with respect to the largest land war in Europe since World War II. And as Nicolas was saying, you can win wars without negotiating a peaceful end. You negotiate after there's been a decisive victory. We're afraid of it. You know, the CIA director, Bill Burns, he was kind of reared on this idea that Russian collapse is going to be the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 21st century. So he wants to avoid that. You know, Timothy Snyder speaks very eloquently about imperial Russia and why it should be dismantled, because it leads to things like Anschlusses in neighboring countries. But within the architecture of America's foreign policy and security establishment, there is a deep-seated school of thinking that says that is the last thing we should be rooting for. And I understand where it's coming from, but I also think it's wrong. And I think, as I've said, there's a mountain of empirical data to suggest why it is wrong. The Russians can take it on the chin and not do something stupid or precipitous. And also, frankly, I think there are a lot of people who are surround Vladimir Putin who see the writing on the wall and know that strategic defeat would mean his end and the end of his dictatorship, even if what comes next is by no means pleasant, and would actually facilitate that program. Because all they want is a return to the status quo ante. They want sanctions lifted. They want to go with their mistresses on holiday in European cities and spend money at Harrods and do all the things they were doing prior to February 2022. So we can play with that. We can work with that to our advantage.
Well, I 100% agree with Michael, basically, and I think that the main point, just to add some very few remarks, I think, first of all, what we have to do, and what I mean the journalists have to do, the activists have to do, I will say conscious leaders have to do, is to talk more day after day, as the Ukrainians did on the social networks, about the crimes committed by Russia. We have to expose the crimes. And sorry to say that, and exposing the crimes is not to say that this child of 6 have been killed by the missiles, this child of 8 has been basically killed voluntarily by a bullet by the Russian soldiers. But we have to show the faces. Sorry, that's emotional, that's emotion. But we know that we have to communicate and to say that basically you Western leaders you don't have only a responsibility on that, but you have to be conscious of a kind of guilt. Of course, the guilty one is Putin, the guilty one are Russian soldiers, etc., of course. But there is also Western guilt, because basically we could have saved, had we the willingness to do so, dozens of thousands of Ukrainian lives. And we didn't want to. That's fact. So basically, it must haunt us for the rest of our lives. So we have I think we have to create again this kind of narrative. The Ukrainians do, I am trying to do, but of course, there must be more relays about that. The second thing is, I think, as I said before, very briefly, we have to refrain to talk about peace. I understand fully President Zelensky talking about peace summit. Personally, I would have called it victory summit or even war summit. Because I know that the Ukrainians want peace. Everyone wants peace, but Russia or China and some others. But I know that we want peace. But when you have this narrative of peace, it creates among the Western leaders, or some of them, and the public opinion, that Ukraine could be ready to accept peace. Sorry, I said that to my Ukrainian friend quite often when I'm heading to Kyiv as well. You see, that's a very ambiguous narrative. Talk about victory, and victory without, of course, any kind of compromises, concessions of any kind. And third narrative, you have to talk about the law, international law, the rule of law, about the crimes, about the punishments, about justice. It's really difficult because you have a skepticism. People saying, okay, Putin, well, there is no chance that we'll go to The Hague. I say, okay, but Milosevic, Karadzic, Mladic, well, who had believed before that they will finally, end their lives there, condemned or passing away before a judgment. So I think we have to insist on this kind of thing and saying that we cannot accept this kind of compromises. And then the fourth narrative that was just framed a little bit by Michael before, we have to have the long-term view. And there is something I am afraid of, discussing quite often with my American counterparts, is that there is absolutely no strategic visions, nor any appetite to frame a strategic vision in DC, or probably in Berlin, Paris as well. London, maybe a little bit more in London, but still. And I think we have to have this strategic vision that have to be also understood with also the kind of alliance or ad hoc alliance, which is not full alliance, between, of course, China, Russia, Iran, and other revisionist countries. And we have to understand this big picture. And, of course, to share it, or at least to have a conversation about it, public conversation.
Thank you so much. We have time for one more question because we started late. So, yes, please.
Hi there, Patrick Kios once again, and this question is for you, Professor Weiss, on your point and answer to the previous question that there has been nothing gained and no kind of new strategies, especially for institutions like newspaper companies and organizations to counter disinformation. And first, just thank you for the commendations to the Justice Department actions. They're a long time coming and a lot of work, but I think there has been progress in terms of countering dis, learned from the 2016 playbook, most recently, end of August, in the strategic decision of so many organizations in the United States not to publish the leaks from the Iraqi agents. And that could be an effective playbook for the future, not necessarily countering dis, but using their institutional power not to promote and not to bring this into the larger ether. Do you agree?
Yeah, no, there was an article yesterday that the Iranians who hacked into the Republican Party email servers and offered this information as oppo research to Kamala Harris's campaign. Harris's campaign was duly suspicious enough and said, no, thank you. Politico ran a story on receiving this information, but not actually laundering it. And yes, there have been antibodies built up. There's no question. And I think, if you read the indictments I was referring to earlier, the level of penetration that the FBI has of Russian malign activities, down to Discord server messages, WhatsApp exchanges, the fact that our friend Mr. Edward Grigorian didn't know the time difference between Paris and Moscow and had to Google it. They knew all this because signals intelligence is quite good. All of that to one side, though, the concern that I have is for every countermeasure we put in place, the Russians are coming up with adaptive, new, aggressive measures. That's one. And two, the countermeasures themselves are seen as forms of hostile action by not a majority necessarily, but a good plurality of our own compatriots, right? Who don't like, having American influencers alluded to or implicitly described in a big DOJ indictment, find the idea of banning, sanctioning any kind of media apparatus, however state-funded and however full of shit as it may be, anathema to American values. So, and look, I have been denounced as a McCarthyist because when I wrote that 2014 paper, one of the prescriptions we put, Peter and I, was there should be in all major news institutions an ombudsman for disinformation. So somebody who will determine whether information that is coming in is factually correct, but also kind of go through how that news organization might have inadvertently fallen for some kind of scheme. I now look at that recommendation and I kind of laugh because I know how it would be received today. Look at what the Elon Musks, the David Sacks, the Matt Taibbis, the Glenn Greenwalds, these are not marginal actors, at least not anymore. The Tucker Carlsons, they denounce this stuff as a kind of censorship, as the actual authoritarianism as opposed to the kind that they are promoting. That's the danger. It's more of our own kind of internal debate and the contentious nature with which even discussing these things is taking place. So that's what worries me more. I'm not saying that government hasn't figured out a few tricks and hasn't done some very good preemptive action. I mean, I know that DOJ has more than what they're letting out, and I can't wait to read it, and I hope it comes out, you know, in quick succession. But these things can also be politicized too. You know, oh, hang on, we're going after MAGA influencers on the eve of an election. We mustn't do that too much lest we be seen as the deep state. You know what I mean? So this is the problem that's kind of baked into, or rather, there's a problem baked into the solution, which is its own problem. But yeah, I'm not saying that there isn't forward movement. It's just, I wish that more Americans would applaud it and see that this is necessary, and it's also a national security issue rather than a freedom of speech or a censorship one.
Thank you. Nicolas, do you have anything to add? Or? Okay. So with this, I would like you to give a round of applause for our terrific speakers. And thank you very much again. And this concludes our day today. Jacob, do you want to say a few words?
Thank you. I just want to say thank you so much for the very brilliant, incredibly brilliant, I have to say, presentations and discussion from this panel. Thank you. Tomorrow, we start at 9:30. And for tomorrow's session, we will look at democratic renewal and multi-stakeholder engagement. How do we move from where we are? For today, I think we actually have more questions than we have answers, and that's what you want at the end of the day. For tomorrow, the question is, how do we move on? Because wars somehow end. Even the 100-year war, I mean, it ended at some point, but I understand where Nicolas is coming from about the P word, peace. I mean, we've got to be careful about that, peace on whose terms. So for tomorrow, we will be looking at this in terms of what happens after this. I mean, after at the end of the First World War, the League of Nations emerged. I mean, as imperfect as it was. Then after the Second World War, of course, the United Nations and various other norms and international legal regimes came thereafter. And even after the conflict in the Balkans, there were still more regimes that emerged thereafter. When this war ends, I mean, what should we expect in terms of new norms? The United Nations, a few days from now, will be having the Summit of the Future. So what should we be thinking about as we move from here? Moving forward, and that's what the panel tomorrow will be looking at. Tomorrow as well, we'll have our second keynote by Professor Tudor Tegerev, and he'll be bringing his wealth of experience over the years working within these spaces to bear in these discussions. And of course, looking forward very much to having my friend Tony Garcia speak on this, drawing on his own experience working as a UN peacekeeper, and of course Peter Clark bringing on his experience working at the United Nations. So ladies and gentlemen, on that note, I just want to say thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. And a round of applause one more time.
Before the round of applause, if I can indulge us in one more question, I just got a note that somebody has asked a question in the chat. Can you let us know what the question is, please? Yes.
So the question in the chat is it evident that the multi-channel Russian propaganda is funded with hundreds of thousands of dollars in all country in the post-Soviet space? What can be the resources for building etiquette basis for changing the imposed public narrative?
I mean, I have no doubt that hundreds of thousands of dollars is a wildly conservative estimate. I mean, you're probably looking at billions of dollars spent all across the world, not just in Europe and North America, but also the global South. I mean, Russia's very, very active in Africa. I've done some investigations into the late Prigozhin's information operations using, believe it or not, white supremacists and neo-Nazis from Europe to go to African countries to act as fake election observers and then to peddle a Pan-Africanist ideology, even though back home they hate black people. You've seen, obviously, what Wagner has got up to in countries such as Mali, Central African Republic. Again, with the kinetic, always there is an informational component as part of their, not even hybrid warfare, I think it is political warfare. Even if you go back into the Cold War era in the 70s and 80s, the money that the Soviets were spending on active measures was, if you factor in or adjust for inflation, exorbitant amounts of money. And obviously Russia is not the Soviet Union, even though a lot of people seem to conflate the two these days. They're doing the same thing. I mean, $10 million going to essentially half a dozen grifting influencers on YouTube. That's a pretty big payday. And so I have no doubt that this is happening across all platforms. I think the question though was, what do we do about it? Which is, I mean, this is the perennial question, and I don't have any good answers anymore because I've been trying to come up with solutions for 10 years. And I sort of lean back and say, well, I'm an investigative reporter. It's not my responsibility to tell you the way the world should be. It's my responsibility to describe the way the world is, right? It's for analysts and philosophers and policymakers to advocate a policy. I mean, I think, though, on Ukraine, winning the war and winning it on Ukraine's terms is its own form of counter-disinformation, right? Because, as I said, apart from what is taking place on the physical battlefield, there is also a battle of narratives and a battle of, is it even possible to do such a thing against so almighty an adversary as Russia? And I believe the answer is yes, and if it turns out I am right, then where does that leave the Russians in terms of these other narratives that they've been, plying for decades? So that would be my very simple yet broad solution to this problem.
Maybe two things that I would add. First of all, when it comes also to disinformation warfare, of course we are all focusing on Russia Today or Sputnik in some countries, including France. Something that I know because I was sued by Russia Today France. I won in the court. But basically, Russia Today launched a lot of what we call SLAPs, which is trials, strategic lawsuits against public participations, against a lot of activists, so did also some Russian activists. But the problem is that you have a lot of unnamed channel in France or Germany, from what I know. You have, because it's banned, Russia Today, Sputnik are banned, in Europe since February or beginning of March 2022. But you had a lot of, let's say on Twitter, on YouTube, etc., channels that appear to be innocent, and they will spread a lot of news. Let's say, you had a car crash, and then you have one people killed, or you have the weather forecast, or you have anything. But when it comes to first of all, foreign policy, of course, they are obviously backing Russia, trying, of course, to put dust, on Ukraine, etc., etc. And when it comes to domestic policy, basically, trying to inflame the divides within the society, the distrust with the government, whatever it is, and to create more appeals against the classical party, spreading a lot of news about the migrants or this kind of thing. And basically we have this kind of channel, and unfortunately in France you had a lot of alerts. But you don't have, and it was something I was pleading before, the Senate and the National Assembly in hearings last year and this year, you don't have active measures on two things. First of all, the possibility to close down those channels. That's the question of freedom of speech, even if France is different than the US. And the second thing is, because there is no willingness, in fact, to do so, to launch investigations about the people responsible for that. Have received, in terms of money, because, what I observe in France, you had the flows of money, dirty money, cash, Well, that's absolutely, I mean, we have to be aware of that. The second thing, and I will just finish on that, following up what Michael was saying, we have to win the war firstly in Ukraine. But we have to win the war against Russia after that, also in Georgia, also in Belarus, also in Syria, also in Latin America, also in Africa, etc. And if Russia is defeated, it will have two very positive snowball effects. First of all, I think it will dramatically diminish corruptions and the flows of money pouring into the Western countries. That will be the first thing. And the second thing, you have a lot of countries who are basically in between, trying to say, well, who will win the war, the West or Russia? Who are still hesitating, who are still betting a little bit on Russia. When Russia will be defeated, they won't anymore, and they will probably come back to the West.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you.